Here come our winners now, a thrilling race and a tremendous effort by Ferrari. Their history is well known, so it's no surprise to fans the world over to see them come out on top once again.
Where am I?
You're in Bed Bath & Beyond, sir. I was just watching you sleep. You look like you're having a crazy dream.
Well, another year and EA and Codemasters have released another Formula 1 game. Now, last year's F1 22 started off on the right foot, giving us VR racing as well as having to adapt to a new physical changes to the car as well. But it was missing the story arc from F1 2021 with Breakpoint, and sadly, if you played F1 22 as frequently as I did, Codemasters did a patch that changed the car's feel and handling, completely reverting back to Formula 1 2021's handling rather than the new F1 22's new designs. But another year later and Codemasters have given us another Formula 1 game with F1 23, with the return of VR racing, the new handling model for both cars as well as racing with a controller on top of a steering wheel, the return of the Breakpoint single player, and red flags. But is F1 23 the ultimate F1 experience?
I don't know.
Again handled by Codemasters and EA Games, F1 23 has just released, and while it's nice to get a yearly sports game, especially if it is the only sport and only sports game that I love, F1 23 feels like a 0.5 release over a full-blown new release title, at least in my opinion.
Are you sure about that?
F1 23 has updated car handling, new tyre mechanics, better controller handling, the return of F1 in VR, and the return of the Netflix-inspired Breakpoint 2.0. Now, we'll start with Breakpoint, which continues the story of Aiden Jackson following his first years in Formula 1 back from Formula 1 2020, but rather than Aiden signing with the big three teams like the Ferraris, the Red Bull or the Mercedes, which was sort of the tease of the original Breakpoint story, we find out that Aiden signs on with Connor Sports. It's a new racing team that started in F1, and Aiden's teammate is none other than Devin Butler, who was the original main rival from the first Breakpoint game. Now, the story does follow Aiden's struggles, Devin's thick-headedness, and a new coming racer from Formula 2 who's making her own mark in the motorsport world. Now, Breakpoint 2.0 feels more like Drive to Survive this time around because there's lots more cutscenes with sort of the camera angles and the backdrops and all that sort of stuff, and Connor Sport has a bit of the Russian Haas or Aston Martin touch to it, with the racer's dad basically funding the team.
I've paid you a small fortune. And this gives you power over me?
Now, just like with previous Breakpoint entries like we had with 2 years ago, you'll have objectives that you need to complete in races, such as overtaking someone before the end of a certain lap, or side missions or side objectives that you'll need to do as you control Aiden or other racers, and you'll have options to do other races as well. Now, when you're playing as Aiden or any other racer, you'll have the option to do sort of normal races. But then you've got the option to go through your social media pages, you can accept phone calls, you can speak to your manager, you can go through Formula 1 news, and in F1 23 you can make decisions as the team principal, giving you optional challenges to do during the race. For example, when you race at Canada, Lance Stroll and Nicholas Latifi, remember him, throw down that they'll beat Connor Sports at the Canadian Grand Prix because it's their home race, and if you accept that challenge, the side challenge is to beat them in the race as well as your normal objective, and that can be easier said than done.
I'm not worried about it! I'm not worried about any of this!
And while the racing for both Breakpoint and the general racing in with co-op, campaign, or just, well, general Formula 1 racing, the cars this year feel like they grip the corners better and generally hug the road while you race. Now, F1 22 did have this, but as I mentioned, one patch during my Formula 1 streams last year between qualifying and a race start changed the overall feel of the cars from hugging the road to kicking your ass out if you touch a rumble strip, which was how the cars handled in F1 2021. At least that's how I felt Codemasters changed the cars. But tyre temperature and grip feels more important this time around. Now, previously when you fly out of the pits on a set of brand new tyres, you generally need a lap or two to bring them up to the correct temperature before you slam through corners. Here in F1 23, even though doing a general safe lap coming out of the pits, it's easy still to have the rear wheel slip out if you plant your feet on the accelerator too soon coming out of a corner.
Now, what do you do next?
Floor it?
Yes. No, don't floor it.
Floor it?
No, don't floor it.
Okay, floor it.
Now there's also been some updates to the steering wheel heads-up display from last year too, which is something I kinda need to look more into with the Thrustmaster SF1000 wheel, to see if it can then mimic this new screen that's in this game so it's a bit more immersive. Now I've played about 60 to 70% of my coverage with the Thrustmaster TSXW steering wheel base and the Ferrari SF1000 steering wheel, and there were some nice additions. One of which is F123 seems to have saved my mapped button, so everywhere was where I left it from last year's entry. But Codemasters have made controller driving easier with precision driving on the controllers, giving those who haven't got a steering wheel setup, or at least not yet, the chance to keep up with mates who do have it. Now with the new heads-up display, it makes it a bit easier to see how hard you're braking or applying the accelerator, especially when playing on a controller, as it's a bit easier to gauge this when you're using your feet with a steering wheel. It does take a bit of time to get used to driving with a controller using precision driving, as you'll be going back and forth in the menus to set it up, but once you've got it set to your preferred handling style, then yeah, playing with a controller in F1 2023 is actually still quite fun. Graphically, F1 23 is of course stunning. The cutscenes in the Breakpoint story are beautiful, and you can see each character's facial muscles move and react to things. Now whether you're playing this with ray tracing on or ray tracing off, or you're playing this on a console, however it is you're playing it, the F1 cars are visually stunning, and just like you'd expect, each F1 car handles and reacts differently to different tracks. So once you get the rhythm of say one track like Bahrain, and then for fun you go to Spa, you're completely given a new challenge. But well, I mentioned that F1 23 feels like more of a 0.5 release rather than full-on new changes, styles of systems, and that's kind of true. Now that's not me dissing the game or Codemasters in any way, no, the driving is still good. As you get used to Bahrain and then move on to Jeddah, if you're doing the standard career mode going from race to race, you'll find yourself challenged if you're not either an avid Formula 1 racing fan or if you drop your focus. There's also some small quality of life changes like say the 35% race distance, the EA RaceNet where you can create, join and manage multiplayer championships directly from a web app, which I can see a couple of my mates of mine being interested in using. We've also got new tracks like Vegas in F1 23 too. Holy shit, all I can say is I can't wait to see the real Vegas race, because my race was chaos.
Are you alright? Engine off, engine off.
You probably should ignore that.
Speaking of which, some of the AI driving is either really smart or defensively cocky. During a handful of races I found I was getting hit in the rear, causing me to spin out and crash into walls, and crash hard. The crash mechanics or characteristics feel more realistic than they have just besides of losing your wheel and bang you're out. Now I also mentioned the updated HUD is quite nice too, and it's easy seeing your brake levels and accelerating too, and it's a massive help for those playing on controllers. But each year these small updates to menus, displays and the inside of garages are just nice updates that Codemasters do. One update that they've done though that a lot of people have asked for is red flags.
Panic! It was deliberate, it was deliberate.
Red flags is where there's a crash that basically needs to stop the race so the car can be removed, the driver can be checked to make sure they're okay, or if they need to send an ambulance, and if they need to repair the walls if they've taken serious damage. We've seen a lot of red flags in the past 2 years or so, and one of them was a missed opportunity for a red flag if you ask me, and hell, Melbourne this year had the most red flags in F1 history. So Codemasters naturally have added red flags to the game, and when these are activated, it's basically like a safety car with no overtaking for a moment or two before you sort of just go into a race restart where you can change out your tyres and replace any damaged parts like say wings, and it's basically a race restart without going back to lap 1. But I mentioned that F1 23 feels like a 0.5 release compared to its new sort of full releases, and it's from no changes being made to the creator driver, to pick outfits, to helmets, to F1 Life, which has been rebranded to F1 World in this year's entry. 80 to 90% of the helmets are the same. Thankfully we don't have to wait for the weekly refresh of the store to see what's in there. You can just go in and pick basically whatever helmet you want if you've got the currency. The livery editor is the same, the character models for your drivers are the same, hell even the clothes your driver wears in the F1 world are the same, including having Stance as a clothing option in the game who has shirts. Stance, who are known for having the best socks in the world.
Right, don't do that face! Don't do that face!
We've got supercars returning, but they're only available in time trials or as optional challenges to do during the career mode, which has me think, sort of, why keep them? And if you want to keep them, why can't we drive the safety car if we're playing private championship with friends, or have a FIA race controller mode where we can watch and control the pace of the race? Career mode is the standard single player, or you can play it with friends, but in a positive and a negative at the same time for some of you, Will Buxton is gone and it's replaced with Natalie Pinkham. And while I much prefer Natalie to Will, it's sad that while all other drivers have great graphics, Natalie doesn't look like she's had that level of attention to detail put on her character model. I'd like to see more Sky Sports team come into future games, like before we start a race, when we see the drivers lineup, we could see Martin Brundle just walk around in the background doing the grid walk. Or we could see, after a race, Nico Rosberg get completely owned by Christian Horner.
Yeah, but you're quite a critical kind of guy,
He's
though,
tough.
aren't you? I mean, you're tough on these guys. I mean,
Just
now you're not in the car, you're happy to criticize all the guys, but...
Now, VR does return in F1 23, but I'm going to do a separate, smaller video review on that as well, as VR didn't release perfectly in F1 22, and rather than potentially reviewing something that might need, say, a day one patch, I think it's only sort of fair to wait a month or so before going into that to see whether it is a game issue or whether I need to get myself a new VR headset. But should you play F1 23? Well, I'll answer that for two ways for you, if you're a new F1 fan and if you're a returning fan of sort of the series going on to the yearly releases. If you are a newer fan and you've watched the great Netflix series, you'll enjoy F1 23 as Breakpoint is fantastic, and it does provide a little previously on style recap as you start Breakpoint 2.0 if you didn't play the first one. That too, if you're a new F1 fan racing with a controller, it's better and more customizable than previous entries while making it more accessible for people who don't have a steering wheel. And while playing with a steering wheel is the way to go, it is now a lot easier to play with a controller. But if you're a Formula 1 fan playing F1 23 after playing previous entries in the series, should you look at this year's game? Well, if you're a giant Formula 1 fan like I am, it's kind of a no-brainer. But there hasn't been much of a change sort of between seasons. And it could be because last year's Formula 1 was a larger change because we had the cars from F1 21 going to F1 22 physically being changed themselves. But whether you've started watching Formula 1 because your husband stays up late drinking, watching the races, yelling at the TV, then from that waking you up, or you've been forced to play Formula 1 against your will just like this man here, always remember to play with each other and play with yourself.